The air inside the federal courthouse was heavy, every glance charged with tension. Behind the polished mahogany bench sat Justice Clarence Thomas, his black robes perfectly draped, eyes sharp with decades of guarded resolve. Across the aisle, Representative Jasmine Crockett stood tall in a blazing red blazer, her natural curls perfectly coiled, radiating confidence. She wasn't there to blend in or to bow down. What happened next would rattle the very foundations of American law and ignite a nationwide debate. Thomas believed a sharp remark could remind this young congresswoman of her place. But Crockett? She'd been preparing her whole life for this exact moment. The 73-year-old conservative icon was about to discover that the 33-year-old Texas Democrat feared no title, no robe, and no institution. Her response would silence the room and send shockwaves through the political landscape. This was more than a legal clash. It was a generational collision, one that could redefine the future of civil rights in America. But before we unpack this explosive exchange, make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss a single moment of these history-making confrontations. For over 3 decades, Clarence Thomas has been a dominant voice on the Supreme Court. Now 73, he has outlasted presidents, watched cultural tide shift, and carved a legacy as one of the staunchest conservative figures in modern judicial history. Raised in rural Georgia by his grandfather after his father walked away, Thomas climbed from a childhood of poverty to the highest legal stage in the country. But his journey left scars. His brutal 1991 confirmation hearings, marked by scandal, accusations, and public humiliation, left him determined to prove his critics wrong. In the decades since, he has become known for his quiet demeanor during arguments and an unshakable belief in originalism, limited government, and judicial restraint. To him, the court is sacred, and the institutions that carried him from obscurity to power deserve deference and protection. Any challenge to that authority feels, in his view, dangerous. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, represents a new era. At just 33, the Texas congresswoman and former civil rights attorney has built a reputation as fearless, sharp, and unrelentingly authentic. Raised in St. Louis, she earned her law degree and quickly made waves defending those the system ignored. She doesn't just practice law, she wields it as a tool for justice. In the Texas legislature, she battled voter suppression. In Congress, she's become the unapologetic voice of a generation that refuses to wait their turn. Her biting comebacks often go viral. Her social media presence rivals that of politicians twice her age, and her message resonates with people hungry for accountability and reform. Where Thomas sees tradition and the sanctity of institutions, Crockett sees barriers built to maintain power. Where he values restraint, she demands bold action. And she isn't intimidated by precedent, robes, or centuries-old norms. This showdown had been brewing for months. Crockett had publicly criticized recent Supreme Court rulings, calling them disconnected from the realities of modern America and dangerous to democracy. She'd questioned the court's legitimacy and pushed for reforms, including time limits and ethics oversight. Meanwhile, Thomas, in private addresses, condemned what he called reckless attacks from younger politicians who, in his eyes, lacked respect for the judiciary. The case that brought them face to face involved voting rights, a battlefield they both knew intimately but saw from opposite perspectives. For Thomas, it was a matter of constitutional interpretation. For Crockett, it was nothing short of a constitutional crisis. This wasn't just about one case. It was about the direction of American democracy itself. Would tradition and institutional authority continue to shape the future, or would a new generation force change through unrelenting public pressure and direct confrontation? Every corner of the legal and political world was watching. Law schools planned live streams of the proceedings. Legal blogs crashed under traffic as millions tuned in. Conservative groups saw this as the moment to reinforce institutional boundaries. Progressives viewed it as a pivotal test of whether their emerging leaders could stand up to one of the most powerful figures in modern judicial history. Clarence Thomas has long stood as a towering figure of conservative judicial power. But beyond the marble columns and hushed reverence of the courtroom, political operatives on both sides were scrambling. Conservatives pushed a narrative of protecting the court's dignity and independence, warning of dangerous attacks on the judiciary. Progressives, on the other hand, framed this moment as a fight for accountability, because, as they reminded anyone who would listen, no one is above the law. For Justice Thomas, this hearing wasn't just another case. It was personal. To him, allowing political pressure to shape the courts threatened everything he had defended for decades. It wasn't just about one decision or one argument. It was about safeguarding an institution he saw as under siege. For Representative Crockett, the fight carried a different weight. This wasn't just about legal theory. It was about proving that no institution, no matter how historic or revered, should operate without transparency and accountability. She saw herself as a voice for a generation unwilling to let power remain unchecked. Inside the courthouse, anticipation crackled like static. Journalists, legal scholars, and political insiders filled every seat, whispering about the showdown they all knew was coming. Even the case itself seemed secondary to the clash of personalities everyone had been waiting for. Justice Thomas entered first, his steady, deliberate steps echoing across the room. At 73, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had weathered every political storm Washington could conjure. His black robes absorbed the light, his presence commanding respect. Then, Crockett arrived, a flash of red in her sharp blazer cutting through the sea of dark suits. At just 33, she radiated unshakable confidence, the kind that comes from never being taught to fear men in power. Her legal team followed close behind, but everyone knew whose moment this really was. The tension was immediate. Thomas offered only the briefest nod, the kind of acknowledgement that carried centuries of hierarchy. Crockett met his gaze without flinching, calm, steady, and absolutely unbothered. When the hearing began, Thomas wasted no time establishing control. He questioned her legal standing, his tone polite but sharpened with condescension. "Representative Crockett," he began, his voice measured but cutting, "this court has been interpreting the Constitution since before you were born. Perhaps you could explain why Congress believes it has the authority to direct this bench on matters of precedent." The gallery went silent. Everyone knew this wasn't just a procedural question, it was a challenge, a reminder of who held the power. Crockett didn't blink. "Justice Thomas," she said evenly, "the Constitution doesn't set an age limit on understanding justice. It only sets a duty to defend it." What followed was a duel of words and wills. Thomas leaned on his decades of experience, citing obscure cases from the 19th century, invoking the wisdom of the framers, and cloaking his arguments in the language of judicial tradition. At one point, his tone slipped into something more paternalistic. "Young lady," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber, "there's a difference between political theater and constitutional law. This court answers to precedent, not popular opinion." The words landed like a thunderclap. The phrase "young lady" rippled across the gallery, and within minutes, legal Twitter exploded, with #young lady trending nationwide. Crockett's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but her voice never wavered. "Justice Thomas," she said firmly, "I am a member of Congress, not a law student. You may address me as Representative Crockett." The exchange broke the unspoken rules of courtroom decorum. Most people deferred to Thomas, bowed to his experience, respected the hierarchy, and accepted his framing. But Crockett didn't flinch, and she certainly didn't back down. The real breaking point came when she openly challenged a precedent Thomas himself had helped establish years ago. She didn't just critique it, she dismantled it, arguing that the framework of originalism wasn't neutral law at all, but a political choice dressed up as judicial philosophy. "Representative," Thomas replied, his voice like steel, his irritation now barely hidden, "you tread dangerously close to undermining the very foundation of this court." "This court doesn't bend to what's trending," Thomas declared, his voice cutting through the chamber. "We interpret the Constitution as it's written, not as politicians wish it to be." But Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned into the microphone, her voice steady but sharp. "Justice Thomas," she said, "that Constitution you're holding up as pure? It was written by politicians, debated by politicians, ratified by politicians, and yes, amended by politicians. Pretending politics and law don't intersect is, in itself, a political choice." That line hit like a lightning strike, exposing the deeper tension that had been simmering for years. For decades, Thomas had defended originalism against critics who dismissed it as rigid, outdated, or even as a tool to preserve inequity. To him, his philosophy wasn't political. It was principled, objective truth. And now, Here stood a young black congresswoman, someone he assumed would understand the weight of his rise from poverty to power, calling his life's work nothing more than conservative politics wrapped in legal jargon. To Thomas, it wasn't just a challenge. It felt like an attack. Outside the courthouse, the clash was already going viral. Progressive activists blasted out clips of Thomas's sharp tone, framing it as condescension. Conservative legal voices fired back, calling his demeanor restrained and professional. Hashtags like #respect the court, #judicial accountability, and Crockett vs. Thomas started trending within the hour. Cable news cut into regular programming. Social feeds exploded. And in the gallery, Crockett staff watched in real time as her support surged, especially from young viewers and, most notably, young black women. Comments flooded in. "Don't let him talk down to you. She's not backing down. This is what courage looks like." As other justices chimed in with their questions, all eyes still drifted back to the duel at the center of the room, Thomas versus Crockett. The conservative justices subtly backed Thomas's line of questioning, while liberal justices seemed to give Crockett more room to press her case. To legal historians and court watchers, it was something entirely new, an elected official openly and unapologetically challenging the authority of a sitting Supreme Court justice in full public view. Thomas's patience began to fray. His questions grew sharper, more personal. He didn't just push back on Crockett's legal arguments. He challenged her grasp of constitutional principles, questioned her respect for the judiciary, even implied she lacked the gravitas to speak for the American people on such weighty matters. Crockett, undeterred, doubled down. She criticized the very structure of lifetime appointments, arguing that accountability demanded transparency and public scrutiny, even for justices. Then Thomas fired the shot meant to put her in her place. "Representative," he said, his voice like stone, "are you here to argue law, or to perform for the cameras? Because this court deals in principles, not political theater." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, the room froze. Everyone knew what that meant. He was calling her a showboater, a politician chasing headlines instead of justice. For many, that accusation might have been silencing. But not for Jasmine Crockett. She'd been underestimated before, because of her age, her gender, her race, and every single time, she'd proved them wrong. Now, with every camera in the room trained on her, she rose. Slowly, intentionally. Her gaze locked on Thomas as she began, her voice calm but resolute. "Justice Thomas," she said, "you want to talk about political theater? Fine. Let's talk about it." The gallery leaned forward. Reporters gripped their pens. Everyone could sense history about to unfold. "For 32 years, she continued, her tone unflinching, "you've sat on this court making decisions that shape the lives of millions of Americans. For 32 years, you've claimed to interpret the Constitution as written. But tell me, Justice Thomas, when the founders wrote that Constitution, did they intend for justices to take luxury vacations from billionaires without telling anyone?" The reaction was immediate, an audible gasp, followed by an eruption of whispers and stunned murmurs. The gallery froze. Lawyers exchanged stunned looks. This wasn't just sharp legal argument anymore. It was a direct strike at Thomas's integrity, a reference to the recent ethics scandals that had dominated headlines for months. Thomas's face tightened, the flush creeping into his cheeks as Crockett pressed forward. "Did the founders," she continued, "envision justices whose families work behind the scenes to influence elections, all while claiming impartiality? Did they intend for the highest court in the land to have less transparency than a local zoning board?" Every word landed like a hammer. Crockett had done her homework, and now she was using it like a weapon. Trip after trip, case after case, conflict after conflict, every ethical controversy tied to Thomas's long tenure, she laid it bare in front of the world. "You want to lecture me about respect for tradition, Justice Thomas," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "What tradition allows a justice to rule on cases connected to organizations that have financially benefited their own family? What tradition says a lifetime appointment means never having to answer questions about conflicts of interest?" Online, the response was instant. #Crockett Truth exploded across social media. Progressive voices hailed her as fearless. Conservative pundits slammed the exchange as reckless and dangerous, calling it an attack on judicial independence. Inside the courtroom, Thomas tried to steady the ship. "Representative," he began, his tone sharp, "this court's ethics procedures are—" But Crockett didn't let him finish. She cut him off. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Interrupting a Supreme Court justice was unthinkable. Unthinkable. That is, for anyone but Jasmine Crockett. She turned, gesturing toward the gallery, toward the cameras, toward the millions watching online. "You talk about young politicians not understanding their place," she said. "But maybe it's time to ask whether you understand yours in a modern democracy. Out there, every one of these people faces elections. They have to explain their decisions. They have to justify their votes. But somehow, the 9 most powerful legal figures in this country never have to face the people whose lives they reshape every single day." It was a devastating moment, not because it was loud or theatrical, but because it rang true. She'd taken Thomas's experience, his decades on the bench, his greatest strength, and flipped it into a liability, casting him as the face of a system more interested in tradition than accountability. "You asked me about constitutional interpretation, Justice Thomas," she said, her voice sharp and steady. "So let me interpret something for you. We the people. That's how our Constitution starts. Not we the justices, not we the appointed. We the people. And when the people's representatives demand answers from their public servants, including the 9 on this bench, that's not disrespect. That's democracy." The legal point was airtight, but the political impact, explosive. In an instant, the story had shifted. This wasn't a young congresswoman stepping out of line. It was an elected official demanding accountability from an unelected branch of government. Social media erupted. Progressive groups shared the clip as proof of why the court needed reform. Conservative commentators decried it as an unprecedented attack on judicial authority. Cable news dropped their regular programming to dissect the moment, calling it one of the most stunning confrontations in the history of the court. Back in the courtroom, Thomas straightened in his chair, visibly shaken but still determined to reassert control. "Representative Crockett," Thomas snapped, his voice rising just enough to betray his frustration, "you are out of line. This court will not be lectured on constitutional principles by someone who clearly doesn't understand the separation of powers." But the damage was already done. His tone sounded defensive, angry, and, worst of all, completely out of touch. And in that moment, he proved Crockett's central point. A man in one of the most powerful positions in the country couldn't even handle being questioned about accountability. Crockett didn't miss a beat. Her reply was calm, razor-sharp, and devastating. "Justice Thomas," she said, her voice unwavering, "the separation of powers doesn't mean separation from accountability. And the fact that you think it does is exactly why we're here today." Then came the moment that would replay millions of times across phones, TVs, and social feeds around the world. Visibly flustered, Thomas leaned forward, pointed a finger toward her, and delivered the line that would come to define the entire showdown. "Young lady," he said, "you are disrespecting tradition, disrespecting this court, and disrespecting the very foundations of American law. Someone your age should show more respect for institutions that have served this nation since long before you were born." The instant the words left his mouth, you could almost see the realization flash across his face. He'd made a critical error. The phrase "young lady," loaded with condescension, steeped in a paternalism that many thought had been left in the past, sparked an immediate firestorm. Within seconds, legal observers in the room understood what had just happened. This wasn't just a heated exchange. It was a 73-year-old man telling a 33-year-old elected official to know her place. By 2024, that language carried explosive cultural weight. Across the country, women, especially professionals who had been dismissed or belittled with the same words, lit up social media. Hashtags like #YoungLady, #RespectDemocracy, and #Judicial Accountability trended within minutes. Stories poured in from women sharing their own experiences of being patronized or silenced in workplaces, schools, and public spaces. And then there was Crockett's reaction, the subtle lift of her brow, the slight tilt of her head, and the calm, almost amused look that seemed to say, "Did he really just go there?" That single frame became an instant meme, perfectly capturing a moment that resonated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. When Crockett finally responded, her voice was clear, deliberate, and devastatingly precise. Justice Thomas, I respect institutions that serve the people. I respect traditions that protect justice. But I will never respect corruption, conflicts of interest, or the idea that holding a government position, any government position, puts someone above accountability to the people of this country. She let the words hang in the air, then delivered the line that would become a rallying cry for a new wave of judicial reform. And if you think questioning those things is disrespectful, then maybe you've forgotten what democracy actually means. The room fell silent. The only sounds were the frantic clicks of reporters' cameras and the scratching of pens capturing every word. Within minutes, hashtags like #Crockett destroys Thomas, #respect democracy, and #judicial accountability were trending globally. The clip of her rebuttal racked up more than 50 million views in the first 24 hours alone. Progressive activists hailed her as the future of the Democratic Party, a fearless voice willing to confront power head-on. Conservative commentators, meanwhile, blasted her as reckless and radical. But across the spectrum, there was one point of consensus. Jasmine Crockett had just shifted the conversation on judicial accountability in America. Thomas, meanwhile, was left with a hard lesson, one that would follow him for years. His attempt to intimidate a younger opponent had backfired in spectacular fashion, making him look defensive and out of step rather than wise and authoritative. And so, in a single day, a 33-year-old congresswoman from Texas had gone toe-to-toe with a 73-year-old Supreme Court justice and emerged victorious. The ripple effects of that confrontation were only just beginning to shake American politics. As soon as Crockett delivered her final line about democracy, phones across the courtroom lit up like fireworks. Reporters were scrambling to push out updates, political aides were sharing clips, and within half an hour, the confrontation had become the lead story across every major news outlet. Headlines bled, Congresswoman confronts Supreme Court Justice in explosive exchange. On social media, the hashtag #Crockett vs. Thomas exploded, generating over 100 million impressions in just the first 6 hours. But it wasn't just the reach that was remarkable, it was the passion behind it. Young Americans, especially young black women, shared the clip with captions like, "This is what courage looks like," and finally, someone said what we've all been thinking. Progressive groups seized the moment instantly, launching fundraising campaigns with slogans like "Stand with Jasmine." Liberal legal organizations used the exchange as fresh fuel for their push for Supreme Court reform. Conservative groups, meanwhile, went on the offensive. They denounced Crockett's actions as an unprecedented and dangerous breach of judicial decorum. Within hours, politicians from both parties were being pressed for their take. The responses fell cleanly along party lines. Progressive leaders rallied around Crockett, praising her for demanding accountability from even the highest offices of power. Democratic leadership issued statements lauding her courage, while prominent progressive voices celebrated her as the face of a new, fearless generation in politics. Conservatives, however, were quick to condemn her. Republican senators called the confrontation disrespectful and a threat to judicial independence, while conservative commentators labeled her radical and anti-constitutional. Legal scholars from the right published op-eds warning that elected officials challenging justices in public threatened the balance of power. Yet the most nuanced responses came from moderates. Some centrist Democrats cautiously praised her questions about ethics but criticized her sharp tone. A few moderate Republicans, in private conversations, acknowledged that Thomas's ethics controversies were troubling, even if they publicly defended the court's independence. Online, the battle for narrative control was fierce. #respect the court trended alongside #accountability now. Conservatives circulated clips of Thomas's remarks to frame him as the voice of reason, while progressives amplified Crockett's responses as proof of a fearless stand against corruption. The generational divide was stark. Viewers under 40 overwhelmingly cheered Crockett, flooding timelines with memes about young lady energy and refusing to bow to the old boys club. Older viewers, however, were more split, some expressing admiration for her boldness, others worrying about the erosion of institutional norms. For many young black women, Crockett became a symbol overnight, a living representation of a generation unwilling to be silenced or sidelined. Professional organizations, social justice groups, and even college sororities began sharing clips of her remarks, hailing them as a masterclass in unapologetic, Fearless advocacy, international outlets quickly seized on the story, captivated by the rare and very public clash between two branches of the U.S. government. European media highlighted themes of democratic accountability, while state-controlled networks in authoritarian countries used the moment to mock what they framed as America's institutional chaos. For Justice Thomas, the fallout was immediate and uncomfortable. Legal ethics experts openly questioned whether his visible frustration toward Crockett had crossed a line, suggesting it may have compromised the impartiality expected of someone in his position. Several prominent law schools even announced that they would analyze the hearing in courses on judicial ethics and government accountability, turning the clash into a case study on how personal tensions can cloud professional judgment at the highest levels. Thomas's allies on the right rushed to defend him, but their support often felt more dutiful than genuine. Behind closed doors, conservative legal scholars worried that he had taken the bait, allowing emotion to override his usual composure and unintentionally weakening the court's image of impartiality. For Crockett, however, the professional consequences were overwhelmingly positive. Within Democratic circles, her profile skyrocketed. Party leadership began floating her name for influential committee assignments. Progressive groups lined up to feature her at major conferences, and colleagues praised her fearlessness in the face of power. The confrontation also reignited debates over Supreme Court reform in ways few had anticipated. Polls showed growing support among younger Americans for reforms like term limits, mandatory ethics rules, and greater transparency. What had once been a distant policy discussion suddenly felt urgent and personal. Progressive activists amplified that sentiment, arguing if justices can't answer basic questions about their conduct, maybe lifetime appointments shouldn't be on the table. Millions who had watched Crockett's fiery exchange seemed to agree. Conservative scholars, meanwhile, warned that such public clashes risked eroding respect for the rule of law. But their warnings were undercut by Thomas's own behavior, which many observers, including some on the right, described as unprofessional. In the days that followed, his allies rolled out a coordinated damage control strategy. Conservative outlets accused Crockett of political theater and inexperience, while sympathetic legal analysts criticized her line of questioning as reckless and dangerous. Thomas, at first, kept quiet, following the court's tradition of steering clear of public commentary. But as speculation grew, his silence became part of the story, especially given his history of speaking at conservative legal events. When he finally broke his silence at a private gathering, leaked audio revealed a defensive, almost bitter tone. "The court cannot function if every decision turns into a personal attack," he reportedly said. "Some people need to learn the difference between accountability and harassment." Instead of calming the storm, those leaked remarks poured fuel on the fire. To many critics, they confirmed what they had suspected, that Thomas was struggling to separate personal pride from institutional duty. For Crockett, the opposite was true. The confrontation propelled her into a new tier of national prominence that even her closest advisors hadn't predicted. Invitations to speak poured in from across the country, solidifying her as one of the most talked-about new voices in American politics. Requests for Representative Crockett's time started pouring in from every direction: universities, civil rights groups, political organizations, and even corporate events wanted to hear from a congresswoman who dared to stand up to one of the most powerful figures in the judiciary. Major donors who had never even heard her name before the confrontation suddenly began writing checks, while progressive groups that once focused on more established politicians started framing Crockett as the future of their movement. Her small team quickly realized they were in over their heads and had to expand just to keep up with the tidal wave of speaking requests, interviews, and collaboration offers. Within a week, her calendar was completely packed for the next 6 months. But perhaps the biggest shift came from younger Americans. To them, Crockett wasn't just a politician. She was a symbol of their generation's refusal to quietly accept outdated hierarchies and unresponsive systems. Her social media following skyrocketed, growing by hundreds of thousands in just days. Posts about the confrontation drew millions of views and engagement levels that analysts described as unheard of for a rank-and-file House member. Data revealed a striking pattern. 78% of her new supporters were under 35, with particularly strong enthusiasm from young women of color who said she represented their values and experiences. Fundraising followed the same trend. Small dollar donations poured in by the thousands: $5, $10, $25, along with messages praising her courage and her refusal to back down. Political strategists began dissecting her playbook as a blueprint for how emerging leaders could gain national attention by taking bold, direct stands against entrenched power. Analysts started calling the showdown a turning point in American politics, a generational changing of the guard moment where younger leaders stopped deferring to authority simply because of age or title. It sparked conferences, law review articles, and even a new concept that scholars began calling the Crockett Doctrine. The idea that elected officials not only could but should confront unelected power when accountability is lacking. Harvard Law School even launched a new seminar titled Judicial Ethics and Democratic Accountability, using the confrontation as a case study in generational politics and institutional reform. The exchange also fueled conversations about ageism in politics. Observers pointed out the irony that Justice Thomas, once underestimated early in his career, had dismissed Crockett in ways that many saw as rooted in the same biases he'd once fought against. Internationally, reactions were mixed. European analysts debated whether the incident exposed institutional cracks or highlighted the strength of democratic self-correction. Either way, the moment reshaped how both allies and critics viewed American democracy. 6 months later, its impact was still reverberating. Crockett had evolved into a nationally recognized figure, appearing on major news platforms and commanding the spotlight at high-profile events. Her unapologetic style, meeting power with direct confrontation, had started influencing a new wave of young politicians. Justice Thomas, on the other hand, found himself increasingly isolated. His defensive reactions and visible frustration had chipped away at his reputation, even among conservatives. To many younger Americans, the episode drove home a clear message. Authority without accountability no longer commanded automatic respect. Progressive organizations capitalized on the moment to call for deeper reforms, framing it as proof that the Supreme Court structure, lifetime appointments and minimal checks, needed to change. Ultimately, the Crockett-Thomas clash became a vivid lesson about shifting power dynamics. Respect for institutions, people were realizing, must be earned through integrity and accountability. And when institutions fail to meet those standards, demanding better isn't rebellion, it's democracy in action. So, what do you think? Was Crockett right to confront Justice Thomas so directly, or did she go too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read them all. And if you found this breakdown of one of the most explosive moments in recent political history as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The clash between entrenched power and rising generational energy is only heating up, and we'll be here to break down every pivotal moment.